I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. Today's episode, Dawn of Duty. It was like clockwork. A rooster crowed, the sun began to rise, and so did Giovanni Ricci. The daily routine of the Ricci family had been a necessity for the last century. Giovanni and his father Giuseppe rose with the rooster's call, finding breakfast already on the table. Neither Giuseppe nor Giovanni could figure out how Caterina, Giovanni's mother and Giuseppe's devoted wife, managed to wake each morning well before the rooster. The aroma of freshly baked bread and brewing coffee filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the farm. Caterina stood as the men ate in silence. There was a lot of silence in the home today. The night before, a loud discussion had erupted between father and son. Europe had been engulfed in war for 8 months, and it seemed inevitable that Italy would soon join the fray. Giovanni had broached the subject of serving his country, which had elicited a passionate response from his father. Giovanni took a sip of the thick black coffee and set the cup down. "Pop, about last night. I don't want to talk about it. You said what you had to say. I said what I had to say." Giuseppe replied curtly, but not angrily. Giovanni reached across the table and took his father's hand. "I wanted to say that I love you, Pop." Giuseppe cupped his other hand over his son's. "Son, I admire you more than you know. I want nothing more than to see you do something important. And if your brother had lived, God rest his soul, we wouldn't even be having this discussion." His older brother Giorgio had drowned after being hit by a large log while braving some rapids in the Po River. He had been knocked unconscious and drowned as a result. That was 6 years ago now. "This farm has been ours for over 100 years. Without you, I'd probably lose it. I'm 51 now. I can no longer do what you do," Giuseppe continued. "I know, Pop." With that, the two arose from the table and made their way outside. The sun was still in the process of rising from the east, and it painted all they saw with a light red-orange glow. Giovanni looked around, and somehow this world, this farm that he grew up on, had a different look this morning. He didn't remember it ever being this beautiful. When the war broke out, Italy initially declared neutrality, much to the relief of its citizens. However, in the wake of a treaty signed with Britain, Italy declared war just 2 weeks after Giuseppe and Giovanni's heated discussion. "Well, son, what are your thoughts?" Giuseppe asked over dinner. "I really don't know. The rumor is they're going to implement conscription. If that happens, we won't have much of a choice." Giovanni was torn. On one hand, he loved Italy and all it stood for. He had been swept up in the recent wave of nationalism. On the other hand, this farm had been in his family's name for over 100 years, and that meant something too. "We always have a choice, son. We always have a choice." "Are you saying that I should defy the order if, or more likely when it comes?" Giovanni asked. Giuseppe looked up at his son, seeing his son's confused face for the first time. "I'm saying that this farm means more to our family than anything. Besides, they won't conscript you. It's nonsense." Giovanni tensed at his father's nonchalance about the matter, his gaze shifting between the field and his father. "And what if you're wrong, Papa? What if they do conscript me? What'll happen to the farm then?" Giuseppe sighed, his weathered hands running through his thinning hair. "Giovanni, my father and his father before him worked this land. We've always found a way, no matter the challenge. This war, it's happening far away. They'll need volunteers, not farmers." Giovanni relaxed a little. "Let's hope you're right, Pop." "I am. And if by some chance I'm wrong, I'll get some kids from the village to help me. But I won't need to do that. This talk of conscription is just that. Talk." Giuseppe spoke from a place of complete confidence. The room fell silent, the clinking of utensils against plates the only sound as they both pondered the uncertain future. Giovanni's mind raced, grappling with the conflicting emotions of duty to his country and responsibility to his family. "Papa," Giovanni said softly, breaking the silence, "I understand what you're saying, but if it does come to conscription, I can't just hide. What will people think of our family? What will they think of me?" Giuseppe looked at his son, seeing the determination and worry etched on his face. "Son, what others think doesn't matter as much as what we know to be true in our hearts. This farm is our legacy, our lifeblood. The world is changing, yes, but some things remain constant. Our duty to this land and to each other is one of those things." Giovanni nodded, absorbing his father's words. "I just don't want to look back and regret my choices, whatever they may be." Giuseppe reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on his son's. "None of us can see the future, Giovanni. We can only make the best decisions with the information we have. Trust your instincts." The weight of his father's words settled over Giovanni, giving him a measure of peace. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with difficult choices, but he also knew he wasn't alone. "Thank you, Papa," Giovanni said, his voice steady. "I'll think about everything you've said." Giuseppe nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good. Now let's finish our meal. We got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." Giuseppe had indeed been wrong. The conscription notice came on a Tuesday afternoon, and after 3 consecutive days of his father trying to convince him to simply ignore the order and stay on the farm, Giovanni left home. The trench was muddy and wet in places, with the duck boards offering little protection from the waterlogged conditions. Along the walls of the trench were small resting areas known as dugouts, simple spots dug into the earth providing a place for soldiers to get some rest. Giovanni lay in the cramped dugout reading a letter from his father that had finally found its way to him. Given the date, the letter was more than 6 months old. Giovanni had left home nearly a year ago, and his father's letters had been few and far between. Giuseppe had indeed managed to hire some young adults, too young for conscription, to help on the farm. This news brought Giovanni some relief, easing much of the guilt he felt for not heeding his father's pleas to ignore the conscription notice. Giovanni folded the letter and closed his eyes. The bitter cold wind swept down from the snow-covered Alps and across the Isonzo River, causing the temperatures to plummet. He had spent the last 7 months here on the Isonzo front. It had been a stalemate the entire time. The terrain was rough and made it difficult for either side to build trenches and any other fortifications. So far, he had gone over the top 7 times. Each time, he and his fellow troops ran into the wall that was the Austro-Hungarian army, Italy's former allies. The brutal encounters had taken a toll on their spirits as the relentless fighting seemed to lead nowhere. A voice brought him back from his light slumber. "Hey now, time to get up. It's my turn." Giovanni opened his eyes to see Enzo, a comrade who had become a friend. He gave a tired smile and nodded, slowly rising to his feet to let Enzo take his place. "Be my guest," Giovanni said with a tired smile. Enzo looked at him and smiled. "You read the letter again, didn't you? You should have slept more. You look exhausted." The loud concussion of an artillery shell hit nearby, sending dirt and debris up into the air and down by their feet. "Good luck sleeping to that going on." "I can sleep through this, and you know that. Have you heard my father snore?" Enzo laughed as he crawled into the dugout. Giovanni grabbed his rifle and helmet, but before he could walk away to attend to a lookout post, he heard Enzo already snoring. "Lucky bastard," he muttered, shaking his head with a mix of amusement and envy. The trench was eerily quiet now, except for the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional rustle of men adjusting their positions. Giovanni carefully navigated the narrow, muddy pathways, his boots squelching with each step. The cold air bit any exposed skin, and he pulled his scarf tighter around his neck. Reaching his lookout post, he nodded to the soldier he was relieving, who gave him a weary but grateful smile. "Stay safe," the soldier said as he clambered down to find some rest. Giovanni settled into his position, peering over the edge of the trench into no man's land. The landscape was a desolate expanse of craters, barbed wire, and the remnants of past battles. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the scene, adding to the sense of desolation. An hour later, Enzo joined him. "That was a short nap," Giovanni noted out loud. Enzo yawned. Yeah, I woke up, got bored, figured I'd come find you. I don't have an assigned post. Maybe we can switch on and off over here. Giovanni jumped down from the post. Well, then I guess it's your turn, bud. Enzo climbed up, and like Giovanni glanced over the ridge into no man's land. Giovanni noticed Enzo's head was a little too far to the trench. Hey, duck down a bit before you get your head blown off. Enzo did as he was told. His face showed that he was grateful that his brief mistake didn't end up fatal. Holy hell, I can't believe I just did that. Giovanni glanced up at him. Well, just be careful. They sat quietly for a while, Enzo watching, Giovanni holding vigil by his side. And for the next 6 hours, they took turns at the post keeping watch over the desolate and cratered countryside. Near sunup, it was Enzo's turn again. Giovanni climbed wearily down and sat in the mud where he occasionally would tap Enzo's leg to make sure that Enzo himself was awake. Giovanni noticed something change in Enzo's body language. He seemed to tense up. What's wrong? What do you see? Enzo didn't answer. He just kept looking, squinting into the distance. Giovanni knew that they were facing east and that Enzo now had the rising sun in his direct view. Sometimes the visions you got from the rising sun could replicate movement, or hide it. I can't tell if there's something out there or if the sun's just messing with me, Enzo replied. Giovanni then watched in horror as Enzo involuntarily craned his neck to see better. No, Enzo! The shot happened fast, and Enzo fell faster. Giovanni's heart skipped a beat as he saw his friend collapse, a small, dark hole in the side of his head where the bullet had struck. The world seemed to slow down, the sound of the battlefield fading into a distant hum as he rushed to Enzo's side. Enzo, stay with me, Giovanni shouted, his hands shaking as he tried to assess the wound. But the lifeless eyes staring back at him told him everything he needed to know. Enzo was gone. He could hear the shrill sound of the whistles indicating that they were going over the top, but the whistles seemed like they were far away. He lay Enzo's head down and looked around him. He then realized that the whistles came from the other set of trenches, the enemy trenches. The enemy was using the harsh sunrise to their advantage. Giovanni shouted urgently down the length of the trench. They're coming over the top! They're coming! His voice was tinged with panic, reflecting the turmoil he felt both inside and out. He picked up his rifle and examined it quickly, realizing with a sinking heart that it had no bayonet. A glance at Enzo's rifle lying next to his lifeless body confirmed the same. No bayonet. Both rifles would be useless in the close-quarter combat that was sure to come. Desperation turned his attention to Enzo's gear. He saw the glint of an American-made Bowie knife, Enzo's prized possession, still sheathed at his side. Giovanni hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. I'm sorry, Enzo, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, as he bent down and carefully removed the knife from his fallen friend's side. With the Bowie knife secured, Giovanni climbed into the position Enzo had been in just minutes before. The glare of the rising sun made it almost impossible to see what he was aiming at, but he started shooting anyways. His heart pounded as he fired into the blinding light, hoping his shots would find their mark and keep the enemy at bay. As he fired, he also heard voices behind him. Many voices saying many different things. Some were barking orders, some were saying their prayers, and some were screaming in an angry panic. One voice was ordering Giovanni to retreat from his position, in which he did. He turned to see a man he had never met before, but the 3 stars on his epaulette indicated that the man was a captain. The captain looked past Giovanni and barked more orders while pointing at the position Giovanni had just vacated. Get the Vickers up there, now! Giovanni watched as 2 men advanced with a British-made Vickers machine gun, which was known for its reliability. The 2 men swiftly set the gun into position near the top of the trench. It happened so quickly that Giovanni could hardly believe it. It felt like only 15 seconds had passed before the gun began its steady chatter. The captain glanced down at Enzo's lifeless body and shouted, Get this body out of here before somebody trips over it and kills themselves! 2 soldiers appeared almost instantly and carried Enzo away. Giovanni had witnessed this kind of efficiency amid chaos before, but today it felt particularly impersonal. Then again, he thought, it has to be. The captain turned his attention to Giovanni. You have no bayonet. I know, sir. Can you throw? Yes, sir, I can throw, Giovanni answered. Good. Run about 60 feet in that direction. You'll find a couple guys with some bushels of grenades. Get down there and start throwing them." The captain then briskly walked the other way up the trench. Giovanni followed the captain's orders. For 15 full minutes, he and two others hurled grenades over the ridge of the trench into no man's land. They couldn't see the impact, so they had no idea whether their efforts were effective or not. Then, almost as quickly as it began, the noise abated. A collective, weary sigh seemed to erupt from the entire trench. A lookout peered cautiously over the edge and announced, "They're retreating! Thank goodness!" The advance was over. It was not the first advance that Giovanni had endured, and it wouldn't be the last, but it was the one where he lost the person he considered his closest friend. The bitter Italian winter emphasized two harsh realities for Giovanni: the relentless passage of time and the necessity of living his military life in solitude. In the 9 months since Enzo's death, he had consciously decided to not get close to anyone. While he would occasionally converse with others, he avoided discussing home, his fears, and most importantly, his feelings. This resolve felt justified, as many of the men he spoke to had met fates similar to or worse than Enzo's. Enzo had been spared prolonged suffering. His end had come in an instant. Some of the men Giovanni knew had writhed in no man's land, screaming in agony, while others had slowly withered away mentally within the trenches. He perched himself in the lookout along the ridge of the trench, staring out into no man's land for any sign of movement. The sun was starting to rise before him, casting an orange glow across the scarred landscape. As he did every morning, he noticed more bodies strewn about that hadn't been there the day before, a grim testament to trench warfare and the dangers of sending men into no man's land. It had been weeks since either side had attempted an assault, and Giovanni felt they were due. A puff of smoke appeared in the distance, followed by another, and then another. Before he knew it, the familiar whistle of incoming shells filled the air, followed by deafening explosions. His rifle was already at his shoulder, and he now peered down the sights, attempting to mentally brace himself for what was to come. His comrades flooded the trenches, readying themselves as well, with some manning the Vickers machine guns now positioned at 10-foot intervals. The shelling continued, and soon their side began to fire back in retaliation. The whistles from across the ravaged field blared, signaling that the enemy was coming and attempting a charge. In the distance, Giovanni could see the men pouring out of their trenches and into no man's land, running full bore in an effort to overwhelm them. Giovanni's heart pounded as he fired shot after shot, reloading quickly before shooting again. Despite the bitter cold, sweat began to sting his eyes. He could see pockets of enemy forces breaking through the barbed wire, indicating they were approximately halfway to their position. He watched body after body fall as he and his comrades shot into the swarm of men coming towards them. Suddenly, a body hurtled towards him from nowhere, crashing into him with brutal force. Together, they tumbled into the trench, the impact jarring him to his core. Giovanni lay on his back, gasping for breath, as the enemy soldier straddled him, raining down furious punches. Running on pure adrenaline, Giovanni raised his arms to shield his face, desperately trying to fend off the brutal assault. In the chaotic struggle, he saw a flash of steel, a large knife clutched in the man's hand, poised for a deadly strike. The blade arced downward, slipping past Giovanni's defenses and plunging deep into his chest. A gunshot echoed through the trench, and the enemy soldier's body went limp, collapsing onto Giovanni and driving the knife even deeper. Giovanni's vision blurred as he fought to stay conscious, the weight of the lifeless body pressing down on him. Giovanni had no sense of time as he lay there, the chaos of battle raging just above him outside the trenches. Every second felt like an eternity. The weight of the dead man pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe, his chest burning with pain from the knife wound. His senses dulled, and he felt as if he were drifting outside his own body, a detached observer of the carnage around him. Suddenly, the crushing weight was lifted, and he gasped as fresh air filled his lungs. Through the haze of pain and disorientation, he heard the distant, almost dreamlike shout of, "Stretcher bearer!" The words echoed in his mind, surreal and disjointed. Strong hands lifted him from the ground, and he felt the rough jostling as he was placed onto a stretcher. The world seemed to spin around him, the sounds of battle fading into a muffled roar. As he was carried through the trenches, he caught glimpses of the sky above, a stark contrast to the dark, muddy hull below. The sky seemed impossibly distant, a reminder of a world beyond the war. Each step the stretcher bearers took sent jolts of pain through his body, but he was beyond feeling it fully now. His vision blurred, the edge of consciousness fraying. Finally, the exhaustion and pain overwhelmed him, and he slipped into a merciful unconsciousness, the sky above, the last thing he saw. The knife had missed his heart by the narrowest of margins, slicing through his chest just inches above and to the left of it. The doctors and nurses around him insisted he was lucky, but Giovanni didn't feel lucky at all. The excruciating pain in his chest was a constant reminder of how close he had come to death. To make matters worse, the fall with the Austro-Hungarian soldier had shattered his clavicle, adding another layer of agony to his already battered body. Each breath sent waves of pain radiating through him, and the weight of his so-called luck felt like a cruel joke. He had been here a week, and yesterday they had given him a new roommate. The bed was empty because the man there before had died of a blood clot in his brain after suffering head trauma. "The food here is terrible," his new roommate muttered, breaking the silence. "It's better than what's at the front, though," Giovanni replied, his voice weak but tinged with a hint of dark humor. "That sure is true, my friend," the roommate retorted, both men sharing a brief, bitter laugh. "How'd you end up in here?" his roommate asked, curiosity in his voice. "I took a damn knife to the chest," Giovanni said, the memory still vivid in his mind. "A knife? Damn. I took shrapnel in a damn training exercise. Can you believe it? A training exercise," the roommate said, shaking his head in disbelief. Giovanni winced as he adjusted himself on the bed, trying to find a more comfortable position. "A training exercise? That's rough. Where were you stationed?" "Near the front, but not quite in the thick of it. We were supposed to be preparing, but I guess no amount of preparation can save you from bad luck," the roommate replied with a sigh. "Yeah. Luck," Giovanni said, his voice trailing off as he stared at the ceiling, lost in thought. The roommate's voice broke through his reverie. "What's your name?" "Giovanni. Giovanni Ricci. Yours?" "Benito. Benito Mussolini." I am so glad you joined me for this episode of World War I Stories. This podcast is a work of fiction. It's written, recorded, and produced by me, Henny B. If you enjoyed our journey through history, I invite you to connect with us on social media. Find us on Facebook and Blue Sky for updates and discussions. Would you like to support the show and gain producer status? Consider becoming a member of our Patreon. Your support not only helps keep the stories alive, but also earns you a special place in our community, with your name read at the end of each episode. I'll see you next time, and until then, keep exploring the past and remember that every story has its echoes in the present. And as always, thank you for listening to World War I Stories.